Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys sent in a bunch of articles about Ukraine this week, and wow, there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to be talking about potential peace deals, NATO's role, and even, we'll get to that last part later, but let's just say things are getting pretty serious.
Definitely. The whole conversation has shifted, from just like sending weapons to Ukraine to now figuring out how this whole thing might actually end.
Yeah, it's a huge change. And speaking of big changes, did you see that phone call between Trump and Putin?
I did, yeah.
It's been all over the news. The BBC even called it a bombshell.
I saw that. It's not just the fact that they talk, it's what Trump is saying about it, like calling it a great call and hinting that the war could be over soon.
Right.
But the biggest thing, I think, is that Zelensky wasn't even part of the call.
Yeah, that's what really stood out to me. Like, how can you have a conversation about the future of Ukraine without even including the Ukrainian president?
Right.
No wonder Zelensky came out and said that Ukraine must not be left out of any negotiations.
Yeah, you can't blame him. He doesn't want his country's fate decided without him at the table.
Exactly. And a lot of European leaders are worried about this too, especially those in NATO.
Yeah, they're concerned that a peace deal that doesn't include Ukraine, one that's rushed through, could end up benefiting Russia too much.
Right.
And it sets a bad example for other conflicts that might be brewing around the world.
Like it could give other countries ideas, right?
Exactly. I mean, look at China and Taiwan, or even North and South Korea.
It's like this situation in Ukraine could embolden them to take similar actions.
That's the worry, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the details here. What would a peace deal even look like?
Sure.
One of the big issues is, of course, the land that Russia is occupying right now.
Right.
We're talking 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea and large parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. And, Zelensky has made it clear he's not given up any territory.
Yeah, he has.
So where does that leave us?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? You have to remember, from Russia's perspective, they've invested a lot in controlling those regions. They're not going to just hand them back without getting something in return.
Right.
So you've got both sides digging in their heels, making it a really tricky situation.
It almost sounds impossible to solve.
It's definitely complicated. There was actually a point where Zelensky proposed a land swap. Basically, Russia keeps some areas in exchange for giving others back.
Oh, interesting.
Specifically, he offered land that Russia currently holds in Ukraine for a piece of Russia's Kursk region that's controlled by Ukraine.
Okay.
But Putin rejected the idea right away.
Wow, why do you think he did that so quickly? Was it about that specific land, or is there something more going on?
I think it's a few things, honestly. For one, the Kursk region is historically and symbolically important to Russia. Giving it up wouldn't be popular.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Plus, accepting the land swap could be seen as admitting Ukraine's claim to the areas Russia currently holds. And that's something Putin wants to avoid. And honestly, I think it's part of a bigger strategy to show that Russia's the one calling the shots here.
Like they're not willing to compromise at all.
Exactly. They're in control. So we have this standoff over territory, and then there's the whole issue of NATO.
Right. Ukraine has been pushing to join NATO for years, and at first it seemed like the US and its allies were on board with it.
Yeah.
But now things seem kind of murky.
Yeah, there are signs that Washington might be having second thoughts about Ukraine joining NATO.
Really?
Some U.S. officials are worried that letting Ukraine in could provoke Russia even more.
So basically they're worried about pushing Putin too far and making things worse.
Exactly. It's a real fear.
Well, wouldn't backing down on NATO membership send the opposite message?
Yeah, you could argue that.
Like, if NATO looks weak or indecisive, wouldn't that actually encourage Putin and other leaders who might be thinking about doing something similar?
It's a valid point. It really shows how difficult this whole situation is for the U.S. and its allies. If they support Ukraine joining NATO, it could be a direct challenge to Russia. But if they back down, it could look like weakness and encourage more aggression. There are no easy answers.
Tough choices with huge consequences either way.
Right. And this is where those internal discussions within the U.S. government get really interesting.
Yeah, because you've got some people pushing for a strong stance against Russia, and others are worried about starting a bigger war.
Exactly. There are a lot of competing priorities. The U.S. wants to support Ukraine and contain Russia, but they also want to avoid a direct conflict. And then you have these recent comments from Vice President JD Vance.
Oh, right, the one where he said sending American troops to Ukraine is still a possibility.
Yeah, that's a big statement.
It is. It's like going from just sending support to actually putting U.S. troops on the ground. What do you make of it?
It's a major change for sure, and it shows there might be some disagreement within the U.S. government about how to handle this.
Right.
On one hand, it could be a way to scare Russia and show that the U.S. is serious about defending Ukraine, but it could also be seen as a dangerous move that makes things even worse.
It's like we're in this high-stakes poker game where each side is trying to outmaneuver the other.
Totally. You raise the stakes with sanctions, they respond by moving troops around. It's super tense.
And then you add in the fact that both the US and Russia have nuclear weapons, and it feels like things could spiral out of control really quickly.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another fascinating part of this whole situation, the possible role of former President Trump. His team is saying he's the only one who can negotiate peace in Ukraine.
Wow.
Given his history with both Russia and Ukraine, it's a claim that's raising a lot of eyebrows.
It makes you think, right? On the one hand, he does have a relationship with Putin, which could be helpful for negotiations, but then there's all the baggage.
Exactly.
I mean, his impeachment was tied to his dealings with Ukraine, and he's always praising Putin. Is he really after peace, or is there something else going on?
That's the big question. Is this about peace in Ukraine, or is it about something else entirely? Personal gain, political maneuvering, who knows? We have to look at his history, his relationship with Putin, and how he usually handles foreign policy if we want to understand what he's really up to.
So many layers to this. I think this is a good place to pause for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From that unexpected phone call to the idea of U.S. troops on the ground, things are changing fast. And when we come back, we'll dig deeper into what might happen next in this conflict and what it could mean for global security.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the possibility of U.S. troops being sent to Ukraine and how that could really make things worse. It reminds me of those other times when the U.S. has debated getting directly involved in conflicts like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Yeah, it feels like we've been down this road before, haven't we? And those past interventions show that there are always unintended consequences, impacts that are hard to predict, long term.
Exactly. It's so easy to get caught up in what's happening right now and forget about the bigger picture. And the potential for things to go wrong here is really worrying. Like a direct fight between U.S. and Russian forces, that could get out of hand so quickly.
And it's important to remember that both countries have nuclear weapons. It's a scary thought, but the stakes are just incredibly high. It's like we're watching this dangerous game play out on the world stage, and no one wants to back down first.
That's a good way to put it. And it really highlights how important diplomacy is. If we want to calm things down and prevent something truly awful from happening, we need careful negotiations. A willingness to find some common ground, even if it means tough compromises.
But is compromise even possible at this point? Zelensky seems set on getting back all of Ukraine's territory, and Putin doesn't seem ready to give an inch. It's like they're both stuck, and neither one wants to make the first move.
It's a tough spot, for sure. And that's why the whole world is watching this so closely. There's a lot of anxiety. Because any miscalculation, any breakdown in communication could have devastating consequences. Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for everyone.
Let's say, just for a second, the U.S. does decide to send troops. What would that even look like? How would that change things on the ground?
Well, the first thing you'd see is a much bigger U.S. military presence in the region. We're talking more troops, aircraft, ships, all to strengthen NATO's defenses and directly support the Ukrainian military. It would completely change the whole dynamic of the conflict.
Would it mean actual fighting between U.S. and Russian troops? Is that realistic? Or would everyone try to avoid that no matter what?
I'm sure both sides would prefer to avoid a direct confrontation. But honestly, the possibility is always there. It's such a tense situation. And the risk of an accident, of misunderstanding what the other side is doing, is really high. It's a powder keg. And one tiny spark could set everything off.
So you're saying even with the best intentions, things could still go really bad really fast.
Exactly. And that's the danger. It's why diplomacy is so important. Open communication, building trust, really trying to understand the other side's point of view. Those are all critical to preventing a larger war.
This is starting to feel a lot like the Cold War. All this tension and the threat of nuclear war hanging over us.
There are some similarities for sure, but we can't forget that the world's a very different place now than it was back then. We're much more connected now, more dependent on each other.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if a major conflict broke out, the consequences would be felt globally. We're already seeing how the war in Ukraine is affecting things like energy prices, supply chains, financial markets all over the world. Imagine how much worse it would be if things escalated.
So even if the fighting stays in Ukraine, everyone would feel the impact.
Absolutely, and that's why it's in everyone's best interest to find a peaceful solution. The alternative is just too dangerous to even think about.
Okay, so let's talk about those peace deals that have been proposed. What are the most important elements that need to be addressed?
Well, we've talked about this, but the issue of territorial control is at the heart of everything. Any peace agreement that's going to last has to deal with what happens to Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And as you said, Zelensky is adamant about not giving up any Ukrainian territory.
Right, but realistically, don't negotiations usually involve some give and take? Is it possible Zelensky might have to soften his position to get a deal? What would that even look like?
Well, you're right. Negotiations are all about finding a middle ground. And that often means each side has to give something up. One possibility is that those disputed regions could get some kind of autonomy, or a special status, while still remaining part of Ukraine. It wouldn't be perfect, but it could be a way to bridge the gap between what each side wants.
And what about Russia? What do they really want out of this? Obviously, they want to keep the land they've taken, but is there more to it than that?
Besides the land, Russia wants security guarantees. They want to be sure that Ukraine never joins NATO, and they want to limit NATO's military activity in Eastern Europe. Basically, they see NATO getting bigger as a threat. They want a buffer zone between themselves and the West.
It sounds like we're at a standstill. Ukraine wants its territory back and security guarantees from the West, while Russia wants to stop NATO from growing and hold on to the land it seized. How do you even reconcile those positions?
It's incredibly complex. The challenge is finding a solution that addresses what each side really needs without violating international law and the idea of sovereignty. It's a delicate balancing act.
It sounds almost impossible.
It's a daunting task, but not impossible. History has shown us that even the most difficult conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. But it takes time, patience, a willingness to understand the other side's point of view.
Okay, so let's say we do get a peace agreement. What happens next? How do you rebuild trust after a conflict like this and make sure the fighting doesn't start up again?
That's the key question. Any peace agreement that is going to last needs to have mechanisms for reconciliation, reconstruction, and long-term security cooperation. It can't just be about ending the fighting. It has to be about building a peace that will last.
What would that look like in practice?
Well, it could involve setting up joint commissions to oversee the implementation of the peace agreement, deploying international peacekeeping forces to keep things stable in the region, providing economic assistance to help rebuild the areas that have been devastated by the war. It would be a long and complex process, but it's absolutely necessary if we want to create a lasting peace.
It sounds like a long road ahead, even if they do reach a peace deal. But let's come back to the U.S. for a minute. We've discussed the possibility of military action, but what about the sanctions that have already been imposed on Russia? How effective have those been in putting pressure on them?
There's no doubt that the sanctions have had a major impact on the Russian economy. They've restricted Russia's access to global financial markets, limited trade, and contributed to rising inflation and unemployment inside Russia.
But have they changed Putin's behavior? I mean, has he shown any sign of backing down because of the sanctions?
That's a difficult question to answer definitively. While the sanctions have definitely hurt Russia, they haven't forced Putin to change his approach in Ukraine. He seems committed to achieving his objectives, even if it means economic pain for Russia.
So what does that tell us? Are sanctions just not strong enough to deter someone like Putin? Are there limits to what they can achieve?
Sanctions are a tool of statecraft. And like any tool, they have their strengths and weaknesses. How effective they are depends on a number of things, like the target country's economic resilience, the willingness of other countries to cooperate, and the ability to maintain pressure over a long period of time.
So they're not a magic bullet, but they're still a useful tool to try to influence behavior.
Exactly. And when you combine them with other diplomatic and economic measures, they can play a big role in shaking a country's actions and encouraging them to pursue a peaceful resolution.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the possibility of U.S. troops on the ground to the challenges of negotiating a peace deal and the impact of sanctions. It's clear this is a really complicated situation, and there are no easy solutions.
You're absolutely right. The important thing is that we're having these discussions, that people all over the world are talking about this war, and that diplomatic efforts are still going on. All of that shows a collective desire for peace.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the negative headlines and the risk of things getting worse, but there has been a huge global response in support of Ukraine. And lots of countries are working hard to find a diplomatic solution.
Right, and while getting to a negotiated settlement is going to be difficult and will probably take a long time, the fact that talks are happening at all is a good sign. It suggests that both sides understand that they need to find a way out of this war, even if their positions seem impossible to reconcile right now.
Okay, let's switch gears one last time and talk about former President Trump's role in this. His team is saying he's the only one who can broker a deal with Putin, but given his history with both Russia and Ukraine, it's tough to believe that.
It's a bold statement, and it's worth looking at carefully. Trump's relationship with Putin has always been a bit of a mystery, a mix of admiration and uncertainty. And when you add in his actions in the past, particularly what he did with Ukraine, it raises serious questions about his intentions. What is he really trying to do here?
I'm thinking about that press conference in Helsinki where he sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies on Russian meddling in the 2016 election. That was a weird moment.
Right, and we can't forget that his first impeachment came directly from him trying to pressure Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. His history with both countries is messy, to say the least. So it's natural to wonder what's motivating him to get involved now.
Is he really trying to bring peace to Ukraine? Or is it something else? Personal gain, political maneuvering, revenge? It's really hard to tell.
It's a puzzle. We know certain things, what he's done before, what he's saying now, his connection with Putin, but we don't have the complete picture. It reminds us that in these big geopolitical events, there are always layers of motives and hidden agendas that we might never fully understand.
So where does that leave us? If we step back from the details and all the speculation, what are the main things you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is that the situation in Ukraine is constantly changing and unpredictable. Things can shift quickly. It's vital to stay informed and be ready for surprises. This isn't something anyone can easily predict or control.
That's true. What else? What other key insights should we keep in mind?
Another important point is that there aren't any easy solutions or quick fixes. This is a multi-layered conflict with a long history and far-reaching consequences. Any solution that might work is going to require careful thought, good analysis, and a willingness to consider a wide range of perspectives. There's no simple answer that will satisfy everyone.
It's a good reminder that these issues are complex. What else should our listeners be thinking about as they follow what's happening?
Finally, and this might be the most important point, the stakes are incredibly high. This isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This conflict could change the entire global order, redefine how countries interact with each other, set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. The decisions made today will have a huge impact on the future.
Those are serious things to think about. We can't afford to be passive or unconcerned.
Exactly. The choices we make today, both individually and as a global community, will determine the kind of world we live in tomorrow. We have a responsibility to stay informed, have these tough conversations, and push for peaceful solutions.
Well said. This deep dive has been fascinating, even though it's been a bit intense. Thank you for guiding us through all of these complex issues and helping us understand what's at stake in Ukraine.
It's been a pleasure. I always appreciate the chance to have these conversations and explore these important topics.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful and something to think about.
Remember, it's up to all of us to stay informed, engaged, and dedicated to building a more peaceful and just world.
Until next time, this is The Deep Dive, signing off.